The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Well, welcome to The Divide. We have with us today Jenan, who works for Interfaith Youth Corps. Hello, Jenan.
Hi.
Really good to have you with us. And maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about Interfaith Youth Corps.
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jenan. I'm the Senior Director of Leadership at Interfaith Youth Corps, also called IFYC, because we love our abbreviations. IFYC is a national nonprofit organization based out of Chicago, and we work with universities and campuses and communities across the country because we really believe that we want to create an America where people of different worldviews, faith traditions, and backgrounds can come together to discover their shared values and live a common life together through common action. Our predominant work in the last 7 to 8 years has been working with colleges and universities across the country. And in the last year or so, we've also started to rethink our commitments in other communal spaces and are now venturing into other communal spaces as well. One of them is a program that we're launching in Chicago around vaccine hesitancy and vaccine access, specifically as it relates to religious communities and how religious communities can play a role in this pivotal moment in having a conversation around safety for the people that they serve.
All right. And can you tell us just briefly, Jenan, about yourself and sort of how you got into this work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Muslim woman. I'm from an immigrant family. My parents are immigrants from India who migrated first to the Middle East. They lived in Qatar as young adults, where they had me and my brother, and I was raised until I was a teenager, at which point we migrated to the United States and lived in the suburbs of Chicago for most of my high school. And then I went to DePaul University in Chicago, which is a Catholic university. And as I mentioned, the joke around IFYC is I'm the Muslim who found Islam at a Catholic university because of DePaul's Catholic values and Catholic commitments to their community. Oftentimes I found myself in spaces where I would be a student volunteering, and we would really be thinking about why we were there, how we were committed to the work that we were doing together, and what were the values that brought us to that work. And through those conversations, I rediscovered my own commitments to my religious tradition, which is Islam. And you know, I feel like in some ways interfaith work is a pathway that was chosen for me rather than by me. 9/11 was my senior year of college. I remember I was actually in front of a group of 30 freshmen at 8:30 that morning, right after the first plane went into the Twin Towers, because I was supposed to be talking about why Muslims do volunteer work and what our commitments are in that space. And I very quickly discovered that that would not be the conversation that would be happening that morning. And there was a student on one side of the class who raised his hand and said, "Why do Muslims hate Americans?" And there was another student on the other side of the class who raised his hand and said, "Why does everyone think Muslim Americans had anything to do with this crime? We had nothing to do with this heinous crime." And in that moment, I knew that those two people needed to have a crucial conversation that I did not have the skills to facilitate. And that was really the catalyst moment in my life that led me into the work that I do now.
Well, that's a great lead-in then to our question for you, which is, what are, do you think, the sort of requisite rules of engagement for constructive conversation in a pluralistic, especially a religiously pluralistic society?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this conversation is that oftentimes when we come into those spaces, we're really thinking about, you know, what are the parameters of the conversation and what are the rules of engagement? And for me, I think it's really more about what is the space that we want to create and what is the foundation of that space? What is the thing that will let us have those conversations, that will hold us when things get really difficult in that conversation? So I often kind of look to a definition, or the way that I think about those spaces is to call them brave spaces rather than safe spaces. And that's not to say that we don't need need safe spaces. I think it's really important to have safe spaces specifically to think about healing and trauma, and sort of bringing ourselves together. And I think we need brave spaces to really do the work of bridge building, to be able to be vulnerable with each other, to be able to lean into a conversation that may not feel very safe, but is needed in order to really start bridging some of the divide that we're feeling. And for me, one of IFYC's alums, who is also an exceptional interfaith leader in her own right, her name is Jen Bailey, Reverend Jen Bailey. She's the founder of an organization called Faith Matters Network, and also founder of another institution called the People's Supper, which was started in 2016 after the national election to kind of bridge political divides in communities as well through breaking bread together. And Jen says, relationships move at the speed of trust, and social change moves at the speed of relationships. So the only way that we can really have those kinds of conversations is through building relationships, and that takes time. And I think that's what's difficult in this particular moment, is that time is a commodity that we feel like we don't have, because it is so difficult right now to bring people together, and to have these meaningful conversations without the weight of polarization that kind of hangs in the room. That's the pink elephant in the room. So at IFYC, we think about something called the Interfaith Triangle, which is sort of our foundation to make that space. And that has 3 aspects. One is attitudes, knowledge, and relationships. So what are the attitudes that we're bringing in with us? Are we aware of where our biases sit? Are we aware of where we are lenient and where we're able to make allowance for something? Are we aware of what our red lines are? What are the things that we're bringing into the room? Knowledge base is really what is the knowledge that we have? Have we done the self work of being curious about who the other person is? Have we done the self work about being curious about who we are in community with? And I often get labeled in a funny sort of sarcastic way at work as I'm the friendly Muslim, right? Like I'm the Muslim that people feel comfortable talking to and asking hard questions of. And I think that that's fine. And at the same time, I take a little bit of offense to that as well, because I think it's also coming from a place of, who's the unfriendly Muslim? Like, what does that mean? And I think that that's, kind of being aware of and doing the work and setting up our own knowledge, I think is really important as we come into these conversations. And finally, the third aspect is really is being committed to relationship and being committed to building relationships and maintaining them. And that takes effort. That takes effort in a family. It takes effort among neighbors, and it definitely takes effort in a space, in an interfaith space where you are going into a relationship with people who believe vastly different things than you do.
So it sounds like if you're trying to sort of promote that conversation, you're trying to lay out sort of what you think of as this brave space, right, in which the conversation can be had. Then does that assume that there's some people that just are not going to be ready for this conversation?
That's very possible. And I think it really depends on, I often like to think about interfaith work. Interfaith work gets a bad reputation. It gets the reputation of being like the hippy dippy, like let's get together and have a drum circle kind of reputation. I actually think meaningful interfaith work is very difficult to do because it brings together people who have very deep belief systems that may be in opposition to one another. And how do you build relationship when that's the case, right? Whether you are from religious communities or whether you are, from a religious community and from a philosophical or values perspective that doesn't necessarily believe in organized religion, I think it's important to think about how that conversation happens and how difficult that actually is. So for me, the brave space is actually, the reason I call it brave space is because someone has to be willing to come into it and has to be willing to embrace the fact that this will be hard and this will require more of you than hummus and potato chips, right? Like this will require more of you than talking about peace, and it will mean more than cultural appropriation, if I'm being really honest. Like it will mean more than all of those things, and that's, I think, really hard to do for a lot of folks. So I like to say people who are ready for this should step into that circle, and then they can be a bridge within the circle, within the brave space, but they can also be a bridge back to their spaces, and bring that back in other, bring their relationships back to their spaces that maybe are not ready for that conversation yet, but they can serve as a bridge in different ways.
Bill, I'm wondering if we need to make the question, maybe flesh out the question a little bit, because I'm sure people have picked up a lot through the context, and we've gotten a good idea of what Jenan focuses on. But when we're talking about the rules of engagement, can you maybe put a finer point on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think of two things that come to my mind that are sort of, I guess I would say, first of all, what you've said, Drew and I certainly, I think we would both wholeheartedly agree, especially doing our podcast. Excuse me. But I'm thinking of the points of tension where things start to sort of melt down. And I think you've touched on a number of things where you can sort of see the meltdown, the issue of time, giving time to something, trust, relationships, just attitudes, all knowledge, basic knowledge. I mean, all of those things are tension points. But I'm wondering if we can go a little bit broader to something like free speech, maybe how some people equate speech with violence. Maybe we could talk about that secondarily, but maybe we can just start with free speech. I mean, I think there's certainly debate in the country over free speech. I was at a Secular Student Alliance convention a few years ago next to the booth for FIRE, which is the largest free speech lobbying group, I think, in DC. And they were telling me that on college campuses, that it's sort of a 50-50 proposition whether a student is in favor of free speech or not. That it was a fairly, even though this organization is overwhelmingly liberal-minded, it's more from the left that traditionally, but that they're really just not finding that same commitment to free speech. And for me, as a Christian, I've, right or not, and I'm kind of interested in your response, and certainly Drew's as well, to this, but I tend to think of free speech as having sat very well with Christianity in the West and in other parts of the world as well. And the reason, which I don't expect you to agree with the narrative, but the reason I would see that is because the narrative is that Jesus came into the world. He didn't judge the world, but he came to save the world, and judgment was forestalled. And so now is this sort of air pocket where people have the opportunity to believe, and belief is the kind of thing you can't force. So it's sort of within the narrative. This is the time to have those conversations, and people have to sort of come to their own sense of whether they believe or not. But do you think that's true sort of outside of the Christian tradition in other parts of the world, from your experience, that there's as much value placed on free speech? And how does that all come back in the end to the current debates about free speech?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to me. And I can speak to this as like a lay person. So I'm not a Muslim scholar. I tend to look at the conversation around free speech as a minority person, as a person from a minority faith tradition, as a person who has 3 mixed race children, as a person who's a woman who wears a scarf and tends to be seen in the world in certain ways, depending on where I'm traveling. I think free speech is important. I think that the flip side of that for me is that speech also has consequences. So for me, it's not so much that free speech is under threat. It is that when speech is hurtful, then what is the conversation around accountability, and what does that look like? And I think that can be different for different things, because I don't think that this is a one size fits all kind of space, right? So I think it depends on the conversation, on what's being said, and on how we're having the conversation. So for me, I think and I'll pivot a little bit back to the sort of rules of engagement question too in this, and I think this relates to both of these conversations, both on free speech and also on how we engage in religiously diverse spaces. I think that there is a set of skills that interfaith leaders, as we call them, can bring that helps navigate those kinds of difficult conversations. One of those skills is being able to facilitate a conversation. It's actually being able to play a role in giving voice and agency to different perspectives in the room, and to be able to mirror those different perspectives in the room, even if you don't agree with them necessarily. I remember I was doing a training once in Atlanta a number of years ago, where we were doing a case study around, I think this was about 10 years ago, there was a phenomenon around Everybody Draw Muhammad Day, which I'm not sure if you guys remember this, but an artist, there was an incident with, I can't remember the name of the cartoon, South Park? Am I remembering this correctly? This cartoon on Comedy Central that tends to be, you know, that tends to be very provocative. You know, they had an episode where they like referenced an image of Muhammad, and they had a way to portray that, and a lot of Muslims were offended, and obviously they started getting threats from more fundamentalist spaces in the Muslim community internationally. And then there was a call in America to kind of have Everybody Draw Muhammad Day to like push back against this pushback on free speech, right? And we were dealing with this through college campuses, where you know, a student group, either that's a free speech group or a secular student group, wanted to do that, and the Muslim groups on campus were like, actually, that's very offensive to us, because we don't have images of Muhammad. That's actually very disrespectful to us. So, you know, is there a way for us? So we were doing this case study, this real-time case study happening at a university that we were in relationship with, where these two student groups were in relationship with one another through the interfaith work on campus, but then we're also in conflict because of this conversation nationally. And basically what happened as I was teaching this class is we were like talking through the different perspectives of what the group who wanted to host the campaign was talking about, what the Muslim students were thinking about, what was happening with each of those groups. And as a part of that, I was, you know, taking notes on this big whiteboard, and I drew a stick figure and I wrote Muhammad next to it. And you could hear the gasp in the room when that happened. And I turned around and I was like, oh, I don't think that's what Muhammad looked like, right? Like, that's not, like, don't mistake that. And it was clear that the conversation needed to be parsed out in a way where people could understand all the complexities of it. And what was interesting in that is basically the way that the relationships between those two student groups actually broke down, because they weren't able to have a conversation around what it means to have free speech that is also honoring the relationships that they had built together. And what would it have looked like for those students to come together and to talk about the value of free speech, what it would come together and talk about the value of having an open and honest conversation that was hard, but also honoring the discomfort and deep religious beliefs that were being disintegrated in that moment as well. And what would that look like? And that's not easy. And there's no like one size fits all solution to a conflict like that. And it's also, for me, I think that's where my work and our work lives, is in those gray spaces where people are figuring out how to be in relationship with one another when the world is telling them that they cannot be in relationship with one another.
Yes, tell us about it, right, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, you really could be the third member of this podcast, because I feel like it's really brilliant how you, with the stick figure, and it just sort of breaking down the two sides into like, what are we really arguing here? Because I feel like that's a point that gets lost in a lot of just culture debates. People get caught up in sort of the defense of their side so much that they kind of forget the real, you know, the spirit behind what they're really arguing for.
Well, on the trust side, I was thinking of this as you were talking, that it used to be you would say something like, well, in order to sort of build trust and commonality, like, why don't we go to a baseball game and just enjoy the baseball game? Like, in other words, spaces which are like allow for common interests from people who are otherwise very different seem like they're shrinking.
They're shrinking, and I think it's because there's also the interactions that we're having all are kind of in echo chambers, right? Like for the most part, like we're all kind of in our own echo chambers, and it's very difficult for us to break out of those echo chambers. And if we want to, for some of us, that's a very intentional stepping out. And for others of us, I think we just don't engage it, even if we're stepping into it because of where we live, or or where we go to school, or whatever that may be. I think part of what interfaith leadership skills do, and I started talking about this a little bit ago, facilitating a conversation is one of those skills. The other skill that I really value personally is really around storytelling and narrative, because that is really a way for people to share who they are without necessarily creating a space that is a debate that goes back and forth, right? It's very difficult to debate somebody's experience and life history and life story. And if we anchor these conversations in narrative rather than in here's the 5, 6, 7, 8 point plan that I want to tell you about, then it helps us draw some of those initial bricks in the foundation of this bridge that we want to create. A story that's from my personal life that I like to share is, as I mentioned, half of my husband's family is Catholic. They're Irish Catholic. And they come from a history, they have a long legacy of law enforcement. And one of his family members, is a police officer, is also a veteran who served in Iraq twice, who, has a very stressed relationship with some of the Muslim parts of Ali's family. My husband's name is Ali, with Ali's family. And I remember the first time that I had to meet him, I was very nervous because I was like, not sure how he's going to react to like hijabi covered woman who's very Muslim looking. And him and I actually, we got along really well. We had a great conversation. We were good buds in Monopoly when we played board games later that night. This is very early on in my marriage. He has a great relationship with my kids. They call him Uncle Patter, which is his name. And right around the time that over the last few years, as conversations around both Islamophobia and also police brutality have been percolating, we've had to think about very difficult ways of engaging those conversations in our family. And it was a really, I had to think a lot about how to engage that conversation with my children and also with my family members who were on either side of that conversation. And I remember when the Christchurch shootings happened, which happened, I think, now almost 2 years ago. Sorry, you're going to see a little visitor in the camera in just a second. That happened almost 2 years ago. He called. He was one of the people who called me to kind of check in and see how I was doing, and also informed me that he would be putting in some extra time that year to serve as security at one of the local mosques during Eid prayers. And to me, that meant a lot. And this is somebody who voted for Trump. It's not. So I'm saying that because it's those relationships are difficult and they're strenuous, and we don't agree on everything. We certainly don't agree on police brutality and police reform and the conversation around how Black bodies are treated in law enforcement. And I think there's a way for us to continue to have those conversations. And there is a way for us to show care and compassion to one another that my 19-year-old self may not have imagined.
Yeah, and I should have said that, by the way, that as we're doing this podcast, it's the week where the left has decided to use baseball as a kind of protest against a Republican policy initiative. And then at the same time, the right has countered by, I guess, calling for the protest of baseball itself or something. But my point was, as you just said, it probably helped a lot that you were good Monopoly buds. Like, you have to have those things in your life with other people in a pluralistic society. And my fear is that everything is political now in those sort of really sacred, non-political, non-religious aspects where we can have fun together, enjoy one another's company and so on. There's not much left except for Star Wars. So
I don't know. It might be contentious too. It depends on who
is now. But what about the speech is violence? Has that come up much in your experience? Because I don't really know how you deal with that. In other words, to me, it's sort of obviously wrong. Like even just like a common sense perspective, but certainly a historical one. Speech isn't itself violence, but I know that creates a whole new sort of framework where people think you can sort of use physical violence to refute speech that is perceived as violent. But what's your experience with that?
Yeah, help me say one more sentence. I'm sorry, I'm trying to.
So this is something
so like a college camp. Oh, go ahead, Drew. You explain it.
Well, I was just going to say it seems to contradict, the idea of what was saying before, but it's something I kind of wanted to hit on too. And if I can say it in a different way, you're talking. You've said a lot, Jenan, about ways to have the conversation, and it goes back to the idea of time, right? Like you have to take the time. You have to find ways to have the conversation. But if the conversation is a non-starter, it doesn't get had because some things to say maybe shouldn't be said, and the example that we've talked about before is intellectuals coming on a college campus and basically the college campus saying, no, we're not going to listen to you, we're not going to have you here, that sort of thing, rather than engaging with the idea. In my mind, this exists as a tension between, yes, there probably are ideas that should not be expressed and should not be engaged with, but where do you draw that line, and how do you decide what ideas need to be won, in the court of opinion, and what ideas need to just be ignored?
Not, by the way, not just not just not invited. I mean, there have been physical assaults, right, on campuses. I think Charles Murray was.
Yeah, ignored might be a generous term to describe how these ideas have been treated.
I think it's the idea that you can use physical violence in some measure to refute speech, which is itself perceived as violent. I don't know if you've experienced that or not, and what do you think of it?
Yeah, I would say we have not experienced that. For me, from my own perspective, I think that violence is never acceptable. Period. That's just me. Violence is never acceptable. I tend to have empathy for folks who are very triggered by certain language, given the legacy and history of trauma and violence. So, for example, when in Charlottesville, people are marching saying the Jews will never replace us, for me, that speech is a problem, and that should not be allowed, right? And similarly in other instances as well. Like that, so for me, like those kinds of things are red lines that should be drawn, and should be drawn very clearly. And when it comes to the exchange of ideas, I tend to be somebody who leans towards saying, register your protest, register your opposition to the idea, and create your own space and invite people to come and hear an alternate perspective. And that's my way of interacting with that in that world, is to say, violence is never acceptable. That's just not how my values live in the world. I have a lot of empathy and a lot of, actually empathy is probably not a strong enough word. I have very strong feelings about language that comes from a historically violent and trauma-induced space. And I feel like there's red lines around that, and we need to figure out how we navigate those. And for me, it's about creating alternate spaces to have productive conversation and registering your opposition instead of completely disrupting a space. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I take it by saying red line, I take it you're saying like I didn't quite catch what it was exactly what they were saying in Charlottesville, but you're saying it should be sort of illegal, or that you should be allowed to sort of physically, violently shut someone up because they're saying that.
Oh, I don't think you should physically violently. I don't think violence is ever okay. But I do think that if there is conversation around, I'm trying to think of things that would be applicable. And this is particularly interesting because we see this play out on college campuses in relationship to Muslim and Jewish relationships a lot, right? Whether something is deemed to be too anti-Semitic. Is anti-Semitic the same as anti-Israel? And that's a really fraught conversation, and there are lots of different opinions on that, right? Similarly, does BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement cannot legitimately have a place, because if it's a free speech is a value, then they should have a place. And what does that mean for them to have a place in the conversation that's happening on campus? And that's a really fraught conversation. And for me, as a Muslim person who is also very active in Muslim Jewish spaces, that's a conversation that does not have clear boundaries, because it really depends on a case-by-case basis. I will call out anti-Semitism when I see it. And at the same time, I don't necessarily agree that anti-Israel or speaking out against Israeli government policies is the same as anti-Semitism. So I can hold both of those values together in tension with each other, which is why I think free speech is such a tense space, because similarly, and that can apply to other spaces as well. It can apply to conversations around race. It can apply to conversations around gender. It can apply to a lot of those spaces. And that's where I think we have to be able to hold opposing ideas with compassion to really navigate, when something is within the realm of free speech and when something is a conversation that needs to be shut down.
I was just thinking of how, and this just may be dating me a little bit, or it just suggests I've watched some Andy Griffith at some point in my life, that I picture sort of this, it's kind of an Americana image of maybe a guy whose wife has been insulted vilely in like Mayberry, and he hauls off and smacks the other person, and then Andy comes in. This is just fiction. This isn't even an episode. It's just in my head. But sort of like there'd be an honor attached to the fact that he kind of stood up, for his family or something. And yet you could, potentially face some legal thing because you were violent, but there was sort of that strange kind of, I guess, old world idealism or whatever. And, but I think now I was asking a little more about sort of mass violence and so on, that, people feel justified carrying out mass violence as a way of sort of promoting their idea, and it feels justified. I think what happened in Minneapolis last summer was more like that to me, but I don't, I haven't delved that deeply into it. And of course, the trial is going on right now in Minneapolis, and I certainly sort of. I think probably the whole country is a little bit on edge about what's going to happen as a result of that. But anyway, I was just curious if you, in your experience, had encountered things like that, and it doesn't sound like very much that's been sort of your experience.
It hasn't been, and I will say, and I come from India, where communal violence between Hindus and Muslims is like very common, and it is also a life and death situation, right? It's not just about burning storefronts, it's about people losing their life. So it's actually, so I'm familiar with it in terms of kind of having that view. And there's actually really interesting research coming out of an academic called Ashutosh Varshney, who's from Harvard, I believe, who talks about how civic fabric, and when communities religiously, racially, whatever the differences are, but when communities are not connected in the civic spaces, that's when that kind of violence tends to be very prominent. And when communities are connected in civic spaces and have a deep points of relationship through those civic spaces, that kind of violence does not necessarily generate in the streets, because there's a trust that's built in, even in a point of tension, that navigates that. And I think for me, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, we saw those protests in Chicago very vividly. We saw the city being shut down in really, like, I don't even know the words to use, in shocking ways, right? Where highways were shut off, and we were basically landlocked in some ways, because the city was trying to not have masses of people go into the downtown area and basically like smash and break storefronts, and lots of other things. For me, I have a lot of, I'll be honest and say I have a lot of conflicting feelings about that, because I think that there is a contingency of people who are carrying out violence simply because they wanted to loot the store or get whatever they needed to get in that moment. And there's also a deep sense of pain that was being, that was on that was out there for us to watch, and that pain was manifested through some of this interaction, where the second day of the protests in Chicago, the city was walled off, so the protests came south to our neighborhood, and we, my husband serves as the president of our local neighborhood board, and he got a call from one of the activist organizations that were helping protesters find safe places to stay in case violence broke out. So we're wondering, like, can you help us find a space that is available for people to go to if they need a safe haven to go to in case violence breaks out, or if they are stuck and it's post curfew and they have nowhere to go. And that was the interesting thing about navigating this as a community, is that the curfew is imposed and the public transportation is shut down and the highways are closed. So there is nowhere for people to go if they didn't bring their own car, right? Like and even if they did bring their own car, there's nowhere for people to go. What was interesting in that moment is we were, as we got this call, my husband got this call and was like looking at me like, who can we go to? We're also in the middle of a pandemic. So all of our faith institutions had not been functioning for the past 4 months, right? Everyone had closed. And in that moment, basically what we decided to do is activate our personal relationships with local pastors, local churches, synagogues, mosques in the area to basically be like, who can open up? Like, who is able to quickly serve as this gathering place this needs to go out on social media in the next 45 minutes before curfew, so that there is a spot for people to go if they are stuck. Because we were also seeing the violence starting to break out in the community, as well as storefronts were being smashed and pharmacies were the pharmacy that's closest to my house was closed for almost 3 months afterwards because they were just completely desolated. And it was really that group of interfaith folks that came through, and a UU church identified themselves as being able to open up even though they had been closed for the last 4 months. And others volunteered to drop off some water and some bedding just in case. And others saw the social media posts and came with their cars to figure out if people needed rides home. And all of that happened in a really quick, like 90-minute space. And that was, to me, to kind of turn your question around, I think that's the other side of that violence, right? That there is a network of people who can answer a call like that, who can meet protesters where they need to be met and give them safety in a moment where they are standing up for a message that needs to be heard, and they are standing in a very unsafe crossroads because they are pushing back on either side of that. They're pushing back on the violent elements that are there within the protests, and they're pushing back on systemic issues that are frankly, that they're standing up against. So for me, that was a really meaningful moment of how we can really flip the conversation and say, what can we do to de-escalate this and to give safety to people as we're having this conversation that needs to be had around systemic issues.
Yeah, very good. You said UU. What is UU church?
Sorry, Unitarian Universalist.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And do they believe in God? I'm not sure. It's an honest question. I don't know.
It depends.
Oh, it depends. Okay,
this
all right.
This particular congregation has a very pluralist view. So some of them do and some of them don't.
Okay, all right. Well, other than Drew, I think other than sort of making Jenan an honorary third host of the podcast, since we're not really delving into specific issues beyond sort of the way in which we engage, I think this may be one of the first interviews where we're truly stumped as to a big divide.
Well, that's good. I'm glad we're sort of all, at least the three of us are on board with trying to, talk through ideas that, can be confrontational, can be problematic. I think, there's always the ever-present issue for me of what I brought up earlier, what should be ignored and what should be sort of won at the court of opinion. And that's kind of what our little podcast is about in some ways, is trying to have that debate and open that question up about maybe we can agree to to discuss this at a and have that. Gosh, I didn't get enough sleep last night, and I'm not forming sentences very well. But
well,
yeah.
the gap is, the one concern is the gap is widening between the various pluralistic groups. I mean, that much is quite clear, and it doesn't really, you know, even though I think in the sort of public forums of university, media, corporations, it's generally the left that's sort of in control of the discussion at this point. If you get into the right circles, that meaning the circles within the right, you know, in their spaces, there's a lot of antipathy growing. So, meaning there's just a strong sort of growing hostility between all the groups, and it's just it's not healthy and not good. And considering America is you know, has been a pretty enjoyable place for me to grow up in my experience. Anyway, Jenan, thank you so much for being here. Really nice to talk to you. And I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.